I was out turkey hunting. We had started hiking at night, and had found our spots at around 4 AM. It was roughly a quarter of a mile from my hunting partner's shouting distance. It was pitch black, and we're trying to keep our lights off. I kept hearing human footsteps coming from almost random directions. After getting sufficiently uncomfortable, I heard a voice that sounded as if it were maybe 10 feet away from me. "Hello, Jack," said a voice. It sounded exactly like my hunting partner. I smelled the smell of coffee and Marlboro Lights. I replied, "Sup," but got no response. I flickered my lighter but didn't see anyone in the area. After saying that a couple of times, I shouted from my hunting partner, and he called back from around a quarter of a mile away. It started raining, and the distance and heat lightning would occasionally illuminate the field. I saw a tree that looked like a human figure, and after a few moments, it wasn't there. More footsteps around me. After a while, when the sun started to faintly show, I decided to take a break and was getting a bit creeped out. So I walked a quarter of a mile to my hunting partner's tree to ask him what he wanted. He said he hadn't left that spot and didn't walk up to meet me at any time in the morning.
My dad was stationed in Germany in the 80s in the US Army, and every 10 years or so they would do what's called a winter forger. Now, this basically means a giant war game where two sides compete against each other. My dad just happened to be there during one of these war games. Now, him and a buddy operated a tank, but due to some complication, they needed reinforcements, so they had to stay put and wait. They got bored and walked around to a small town nearby to get a bottle of apple corn, a type of alcohol. As they walked into town, they saw a young boy riding a bicycle. They stopped him and asked him the nearest place to go and grab a bottle, and he gave them directions. As they were following his directions, they saw a bar with a bunch of people in it. But for some reason, the kid never mentioned it, but they went in anyway. As soon as they got in, everybody stopped what they were doing and stared at my dad and his buddy. I mean, literally everyone, even the waitress. Now after 5 seconds, everyone simultaneously started acting normal, like nothing ever happened. A little creepy. They asked to buy a bottle of apple corn. However, they refused to get any, instead giving them both 3 shots of it. After this, they kept insisting that they sat down to eat. They were passing around giant bowls of food to everybody. Somebody would eat a bit from the bowl and then pass it on to the next person. But my dad didn't want any food, they just wanted to buy a bottle of apple corn, but they constantly refused, offering only shots and food. Finally they got tired of it. As they were walking around looking for somewhere else to get the apple corn, they passed a young boy again and asked him about the bar, and they refused to sell them the apple corn. The boy turns around and stammers, "You went to that place?" and immediately circles away from them as fast as he possibly can. My dad and his buddy look at each other like, what the hell? They're curious and they walk back to the bar and check it out again. But when they get there, the bar is completely empty and the lights are off. They stare inside through the glass and the chairs are all upside down on the table and there's cobwebs everywhere. The shelves behind the bar are completely empty and there's no alcohol there. They actually went around to check out the whole place to make sure it was the same. And sure enough, it was the same bar they were in literally minutes ago, crowded with people. They then found another bar and bought some apple corn and quickly got out of there. To this day, my dad and his buddy swear that it's the creepiest thing that they've ever witnessed, and they still have no explanation.
We were camping in Sequoia National Forest, and our campground was as secluded as it gets. Just to reach it, you had to go on a treacherous one-way dirt road for over an hour. We arrived in the afternoon to find the campground only had 2 other inhabitants. The campground host, a little older lady, and a little dog. We set everything up, cooked dinner, and settled in and get some rest as the sun went down. Throughout the night, we would be awakened here and there by sounds. Nothing out of the ordinary, for camping in the middle of the dense wood. Just things like branches snapping and things moving in the trees. At 11 PM, we heard something going through the bolted trash cans around the campground. Knowing we were in bear country, I beat my car a few times and tried to scare it off. This happened a few times, and whatever it was kept coming back. As night went on, things got more and more strange. A meadow about 100 yards from where our tent was populated by a few wild cattle that earlier that day made some kind of scene for something terrible going down. We heard the sound of cows screaming bloody murder, like they were being torn apart. My initial thought was, shit, it's a bear or cougar pack of coyotes, or some kind of predator that was messing those cows up. It's obvious they were in distress. But after that, there was a noise I heard that I'd never heard any animal make before. It was a loud, deep howl, almost like a portamento, where it starts low and rises higher and higher in pitch. It was loud as hell. I could feel it in my chest vibrating. Needless to say, we were extremely freaked. It didn't stop there. Along with the sounds of cows dying, we also heard things like massive branches being torn off trees around us, something knocking against trees like with a rock or stick, and at one point, something big was walking around our camp. When we stuck a flashlight to the window in the tent, something massive went running by our tent, shaking the ground as it ran, as it was fast as hell. Eventually, all of this commotion died down, but not before that howl/shriek was let out again. This time further away in the woods. Of course, I didn't sleep that night. I anxiously waited for the sun to rise before inspecting the campground. Even though we heard trash being ripped and bottles clanking together, the trash cans weren't knocked over. They were still chained shut, which we thought was odd because a bear would have surely made more mess. We searched for bear and cougar tracks, but the only things we found looked like human tracks, like bare human feet, maybe a little bigger, but normal size. Not like those huge Bigfoot casts people have taken. I will say that I am far from a conspiracy theorist. I'm a huge skeptic. The thought of Bigfoot has always made me laugh. But still, as the day went on, and the prospect of spending another night there, now being the only campers present, became less and less appealing. We packed up quickly before the sun got too low, and got out of there. On our way home, whilst discussing what happened, my girlfriend pulled up various Sasquatch sounds on YouTube. Some were ridiculous, and some sounded identical to what we'd heard. Let's just say, I'm a little less skeptical now than I used to be.
I love going for night walks sometimes just because I dislike people, but I've been trying to get into shape for a while now, so nighttime's great. For that I have a route through some fields which are surrounded by cities, even highways. One major city skyline is visible from the paths I take on normal daylight and night. It looks really beautiful. Sometimes, however, we get really thick fog because of the mountain range. So one night I was out for a walk and it was super thick fog everywhere. It was fun at first. I couldn't even see to the end of the light post. I did have my headlamp on, but again I could barely see 1 foot in front of me, and I was walking on fairly unfamiliar paths. Usually you'd hear the sound of the highway close by because it's very busy all day and night. Usually fog can carry sound too, but at some point I noticed I didn't hear it at all anymore. I didn't even hear anything, in fact. There wasn't even wind. This was especially weird because the path that I was walking on had no trees, so I should have at least been able to hear something. So I got to a part that I knew well, and I decided to just keep on with my path and soldiered on. After a while, I heard a sharp whistling. That in itself wasn't too weird. People walk their dogs a lot in the fields and it wasn't too far away from where they do that. However, the whistling continued, and it sounded throughout the night, and it sounded as if it was getting closer to me and louder. It was somewhat melodic after a while, more like somebody trying to play a song than trying to catch a dog's attention or a person. This is a really weird part, the direction it come from, the open and very muddy fields. While it got closer and closer, sure, you could walk there, but you'd make plenty of noise and probably lose a shoe or so trying to wade throughout the mess. This was silent, just whistling. I tried to ignore it, but it creeped the hell out of me, so I just kept on walking, slowly getting colder and colder, despite walking up the hill and faster than usual. Now the whistling continued, and out of the corner of my eye, I could see something make out a silhouette, illuminated by my bobbing headlamp. That's when I started to really freak out. I live in Germany, and we have a tale here of the Nebelwerfer, which basically translates to fog whistlers. They've been in some historic accounts too. One of the major ones happened during the 30-Year War, where a small village very close to Deselfon in 1622 was surrounded by a heavy fog overnight. Whistling was heard all around it and throughout the night and the next day, and more than a dozen people were actually found missing, and never to be found again after that. It is said that these try and lure their unsuspecting victims closer. If you can whistle their favourite tune, you might survive. If not, they'll devour you. I'm not sure how much I believe this, but apparently they say right on the edge of how far you can just not see them from. They are also really stalk people and are out and about alone. Unless there's dire times, then they might come out, for example in war. So remembering all of this, it freaked the hell out of me and I sprinted home. It's the only experience I've ever had like it in my life. The part that really creeps me out is the silence. The fact that there were no sounds anywhere around me, nothing to indicate anybody was close or far, just whistling that was extremely close to me.
I was out for a long run, probably around 12 miles on dirt roads, through Iowa farmland, with plenty of abandoned barns and old buildings alongside it. As I'm running, I see this figure up ahead walking on the road. It's a fairly old man, well groomed. If I compare him to anyone, he looks a bit like Jerry Sandusky, but greyer, with more black in the corner of his mouth and eyes. He was wearing a white sweatsuit and carrying a plastic bag over one shoulder. It looked heavy and full. The man smiled at me, and I smiled back, even though physically, I was distancing myself from him as much as possible. As I passed by him, I began to feel dizzy and nauseous. His presence just felt so wrong. His smile was off. I actually had to swallow back vomit, and it had begun to climb my throat. My adrenaline had gone up, and my pulse was hammering. When I looked back, a couple of meters later, he was gone.
I frequently go bushwalking all throughout the Blue Mountains, and I've done so since I was a kid with my dad. Sometimes for shorter walks I go alone. That could be dangerous. As a woman, I could have added the risk of being attacked or whatever, but I always carry a couple of knives on me, so I don't really feel that threatened. And I always bring a satellite phone. I just love and crave that feeling of being surrounded entirely by the bush. Anyway, around 5 years ago, I thought it would be a good idea to do an overnight walk by myself. Bad idea. The walk was fine. There was 3 or 4 groups of people who came by. That was only on the first day. I picked a little spot to stay overnight towards dusk. I cut a few ferns back and I had a space to stick my little one-person tent in. I was maybe 30 meters from the track, mostly out of sight and behind trees and such. There were lots of wildlife sounds as I drifted off to sleep. Though I thought there was a strange sound, I can only describe it as a bonding sound, like somebody was flitting through the bush right past me. But it was way too fast with too few steps for a person to be doing so. And if you've ever seen the bush in this part of Australia, you'd know that there isn't much space on the ground to walk freely if you're off the track. You have to at least wade through the bushes and ferns, etc. Now this was pretty unsettling, but I thought it was probably just something falling from a tree or whatever. The next morning, I had breakfast and packed up my things, and I kept on going along the track. I passed a couple of people going the other way. Then I was alone again for maybe half an hour. Then I heard the sound of a stick being broken, like from somebody stepping on it. The sound come from behind me and to my left, and away from the track. I turned around and nearly died to my feet. A fair distance into the bush was something standing, staring directly at me. I wanted to believe it was a person, but it wasn't. I can't judge the exact height, but it was obviously very tall. It may have been a skinwalker. Its skin was darkish grey or brown. It had this horrifically large head and these black eyes. I couldn't see a mouth or anything. Its arms were really long too. I was almost crying. Tears welled up in my eyes. I was completely frozen, staring at this. It was like my legs were locked in position. The longer I stared, the worse it would get, and I felt a heightened feeling of absolute dread. I've never felt this way before and haven't since. This fear kept on building up until eventually I could see my heartbeat in my veins in my vision. And I suddenly bolted. I sprinted away, continuing on the track. I ran and was way too scared to look behind me. Tears were streaming through my eyes as I was running away. I didn't stop until I actually caught up with those people going the same direction as me. They looked at me saying, "Oh my god, are you okay?" I was running for so long that I could barely breathe and said something, but I asked them if they could go the rest of the way with me. Now it took me 6 months before I started bushwalking again, and it's never been the same since.
When I was a teenager, I used to go out camping by myself. I had a spot where I liked that was a few fences from my grandparents' house in the middle of nowhere. One of the places I cut through was a pasture full of cattle. Around cattle, especially cattle unfamiliar with me, I tried to be careful not to spook them, but otherwise, cows are pretty easy going. This was about a mile away from my grandparents' house, and probably 2 from my destination. At the time, I slipped through the fence to find the cattle already freaked out. They were insanely agitated about something that I was not aware of, so I stayed well clear from them. I had a good time camping that night, and packed up next morning. As I went back into the pasture, however, there was this ridiculously bad smell. It smelled like a skunk had fought with something in a fertilized barrel of shit, and then broke the barrel. It was awful. I tried to look for the cows, to make sure I wasn't going to give them a nasty surprise, but they were nowhere to be seen. There were some bushes and trees, so I thought maybe they were just out of sight. Not long after, I found the cows. All of them had been shot and ripped apart. Someone had carefully shot them in the head with a bolt gun style thing, and eviscerated all of them. They had also dug this little shallow ravine and piled the bodies up. It was abominable. I hightailed it out of there to get my stuff and gear, but it was gone. I sat it on a rock about 100 yards away, easily within eyeshot, and when I get back, nowhere to be seen. I had been gone for a whole 5 minutes, and I think Usain Bolt wouldn't have been able to catch me on my way home. I never heard anything about those cows, and don't think I'll go back to that camping spot again.
When I was a little younger, I spent nearly all my time out in the woods by myself. I was slowly charting the acreage behind my family's house that was isolated by miles of back roads. One day around midday in September or October, I decided to take a long hike into the area we didn't own. We had a black lab, Sandy, who I brought with me for safety, and we walked to a creek that we followed some way back into the woods. After some distance, far enough that I no longer recognised my surroundings, the creek spilled into a small reservoir the size of a backyard pool. I remember clearly that it was a time of year where the leaves started to change colour, I remember the pool was black with silt and decorated by downed trees. Once I stepped around the very edge of the pool, there was a shift. Like if you messed with the contrast or saturation too much in a photo edit. I remember the colour, temperature, light, sound, and even objects appeared different to me. Now the water became very clear, and there was notably lush vegetation densely packed around the edge of the pool. I froze for what felt like a number of seconds before I felt something pulling me. My dog was really tugging at me on the leash. As I turned my head, everything snapped back to normal. However, my surroundings were now dark, and it was evidently sunset. Confused to this day, I've confirmed with family that I left the house after lunch, and based on the ground I covered, there was no way I'd been out in the woods for longer than 2 hours. Maybe even 1. Sandy was pulling me towards home, towards voices calling. Apparently I'd been in the woods for 8 hours. Now it didn't make sense with the time on my watch either. I eventually moved away but decided to return. The owners were gracious enough to let me have a walk around on my own. I ended up following the same path and relocating that creek again. It was dry season, but I found the area where it must have been, and I confirmed that there is no way that I could have been in the woods for that long. Now I'm a rational person, but I really have no idea what happened to this day.
Driving through the middle of Montana one night, I was going at about 100 miles per hour when I passed something on the side of the road that looked like a mangled body. I turned around at the next pass, came back, definitely a body. I put my lights on it and tried to call 911, but I had no cell phone reception. I got out of the car to see if I could pick up any reception, and the lights were still on. But there was nothing there except the blood spatters. I drove away quickly.
In 2014, I was driving at night on Highway 81 in SW, Oklahoma. It was around 2 AM. I hadn't seen another car for at least 30 minutes. I was on a stretch of road between Jiska and Rush Springs. In other words, I was in the middle of nowhere. I now come over a hill and see a car upside down in the ditch and a body just lying there, out of the car. It kinda looked like he was laying on his side asleep. I slam on the brakes and get out of the car and run over to him. I touch his shoulder and then realise the worst. He's died in a very nasty way. I could smell whiskey coming out of his gut. It was horrifying. He had no pulse. So I get my phone out and dial 911. I give them an estimate of where I am. They say the nearest help is at least 30 minutes away and I needed to wait with the wreck until they got there. Well, crap. I hung up the phone and looked around. I'm alone in BFE, Oklahoma. The only companion is a passed away man. Not knowing what to do, I took his hand and said the Lord's Prayer, then covered his face with a shirt that was hanging outside of the car. I was seriously shaking now. It was then that I heard the coyotes starting to turn up. If you haven't heard this sound, it's akin to small children being hurt badly. They wail and screech in what I think is a big circle around me and this man. It's been probably 15 minutes and no cars have showed up. I hear them on the highway. They are crossing just out of the headlights of my car. Now I have a decision. Do I get in my car and let them come up and tear on this guy, or do I find something to swing and protect his body? I ended up choosing the latter. I go to get the tire iron out of my trunk and go back to where this guy's laying. I guess I'm making a stand. I wait there for 5 minutes and I hear them running around. It's totally dark. I am not truly in control of this situation. Something very primal comes over my brain. It's akin to rage, along with a heavy dose fear. Whatever was gonna happen, I was gonna have to fight like crazy to try and survive now. At this very moment, I see car lights. Finally, a car shows up, and wouldn't you know, it's a Pontic God AM, full of meffed up country boys. They pull over and look at me, see the dead guy and the car. I say, guys, he's dead. There are coyotes circling us now. They go to their cars and pull out several handguns and a couple of flashlights. They're really excited to be able to hopefully kill these things, although they were almost as unnerving as wild animals out in the dark. A couple of minutes pass and we hear a siren off in the distance. The guy says, "It's the cops," and they jump in the car and haul ass. I'm alone now, me and this poor man. 60 seconds later, a state trooper shows up, then 2 deputies, then finally 3 city cops, and then an ambulance. They took the guy over and pronounced him dead. They asked me 100 questions asking about what I was doing out there. Eventually they said, "Thanks, you can go now." I left and started driving down this pitch black road again, knowing that I could have been in a battle for my life then.
My cousin is with the Forest Service in Montana/Wyoming, and I decided to go up there with her to literally test the waters. She does hydrology and has to ride out into the middle of nowhere to test streams and do snow runoffs to ensure there's no contaminants. So I thought it sounded fun and wanted to do a bit of a tour with her. We were going to camp out there for 2 nights, so we packed up all our gear in saddlebags and saddle bodies and started out. The first day and night was amazing. Beautiful scenery and amazing air quality. It really is so peaceful out there. I love that area and wish to go back there more often. Anyway, we started out on the second day, and my cousin said, "Do you want to see something weird?" "Of course," I said. And she led me on a bit of a side journey to this tiny little ravine. We ended up travelling about 2 hours away from the actual path. At the very end of this land, she dismounted and told me to get off the horse as well. We tied them to a little clearing, and I follow her to this tiny wildlife path and bring our little rechargeable radio. This is the one that you can plug in or wind up, and it also acts as a lantern if you need it to, but that really kills the batteries. So out here in the middle of nowhere, there is a huge coil of wire sticking out of the ground. The wire itself is not wildly large, like some buried transmission wire, but small, like a 10 or 12 gauge wire from a house. It trailed off into the bushes and the trees, so naturally I decided to follow the damn thing out of curiosity. My cousin trotted behind me as I do, and after coming straight up from the ground, it strung across limbs of trees, then back to the ground, snakes around a rock, and finally deadens into an outlet. The outlet is mounted on the side of a desk. It looks like a school teacher's desk from when I was growing up, with a metal base and a pseudo wood/plastic topping. No chair, no building, nothing. Just this outlet and the desk. I'm staring confused as hell at this desk, in a forest in the middle of nowhere. My cousin pulls the cord and plugs it into the outlet, and it lit up and started blaring static. That wire was fed from somewhere. Now the place we had had no road access and no buildings for many, many miles. With no other people around, and still a live outlet. Weird as shit.
I had an experience that really never left me. It was in the woods of Portola Valley. I frequently camped by a stream, maybe 3 or 4 weeks in total camping time if you added it all up. And there's always the sound of the stream in the background, as well as gentle wind, cracking sounds and occasional animals, normal animal sounds. Well, one night I was woken up by a nightmare of a black/greyish creature standing by a campsite, not doing anything, just standing there. It had no features, it was just a dark colour. I don't usually have paranormal fantasies or dream this way at all, so it was a first and very scary for me. I was so scared that I woke up startled. I wake up and then things just don't feel right. I then panic a bit and start to wake up my SO and tell him I had a nightmare. As I'm waking up, I had to notice that there's no sound, as in 0 sounds, not even the sound of air moving. The creek sound is gone, wildlife, everything. The entire campground is silent. No, I've never felt such a feeling of dread before, and I've never felt it since. I tell him that we need to go now. The more I think about it, the more creepy it feels. Thank God that he was actually listening to me. He had some similar experiences growing up, and he's very scared by the lack of sound. We pack up and leave in probably less than 10 minutes. That feeling of sticky, aggressive oppression doesn't leave us until we're completely back in town. This is the stuff that's going to sound the craziest. My car would not go over 15 miles per hour the whole way down the hill. It wasn't in second gear. No, we weren't higher. And my SO and I kept trying everything, and I kept saying we need to get out of here now. As soon as we got back to town, it went back to normal. To this day, I have no explanation for it whatsoever.
I was at my in-laws' house for Thanksgiving in Montana. They live about 60 miles south of the Canadian border. They are what I would call comfortable survivalists and live way off the grid. No TV, no cell reception, too far up in the mountains for that. Great people, just don't like towns, and my wife was homeschooled. I decided I would go for a morning deer hunt on Thanksgiving. It's a great location for it, as they are right in the middle of prime deer, elk and bear country. Their house borders national forest land on 3 sides, so pretty easy to find yourself in the middle of nowhere, because you're already there. My father-in-law insists I leave the house at the crack of dawn. Where I hunt, they don't start moving until around 8 or 9. But of course I agree with him and head out before light. I've got a headlamp on, walking down a narrow trail in thick coverage, and can see about 10 feet in front of me. It's super cold but no snow, and dark as hell, and 20 miles from the nearest town. My father-in-law says that we have about 25 minutes hike, and that we'll get to a small curvy valley that is a newly finished logging project, perfect hunting area for deer, as there is minimal coverage and you can see a mile down the valley. The trail meets up with the rugged logging road, and as I walk up, I can see large slash piles from the logging project all over the place. I find a good spot and sit and listen. I'm sitting there and it's getting light, looking around for deer. To my right, 200 yards away, there is a slash pile with something moving around it. I pull up my little binoculars and look. There's a deer with its legs in the air covered in blood and dirt. I start to feel the hair on my neck straighten out. The deer disappears inside the pile of branches, and then I see a mountain lion come out from the pile, nose red with blood. He scrapes all around the area for a few minutes. I'm guessing he smelled or sensed me, because he was walking around in little circles and looking up into the air. I didn't know what the hell to do. I was kind of panicked because they're very territorial and will definitely attack people. So me being a cool guy, I fired my gun in the air and walked back to my in-laws' place in circles. I did see the lion run off, but still, it was the scariest walk I've ever been on. And of course, played it cool when I got back, and told my wife what happened that night.
I hunt a lot, and my father has property in South Texas, and I love going out there to spend a lot of time hunting. So one weekend, it was mid-November and really cold out. I decided that I would head to my blind late afternoon and stay there throughout the night. When I arrived to the blind, I hadn't seen any animals on the way at all, and we're talking like a good 2 miles of walking and not even seeing birds. I didn't think anything of it since it was winter, but of course I should have still seen some birds and whatnot. As I arrived to the blind, I was setting up everything and pulled out this bottle of doe yoring, trying to pick it up and lure a buck with it. Now, from the very moment that I opened it, I started hearing movement on this right ridge behind the blind and kept trying to look out of the small window to see anything. All of a sudden, there was this really loud thud that hit the side of the blind. I jumped and Thought maybe a deer had fallen off the ridge and hit the blind. I couldn't see anything, so I opened the door and saw a huge rock and a nice dent in the side of the blind. Now something threw this rock that must have weighed close to 30 pounds. I grabbed my rifle and said screw this. Most likely out loud, threw open the blind door, jumped 6 or 7 feet to the ground and started running back to camp. Now nothing else actually happened to me that night. I didn't hear any coyotes yelping, howling or anything at all. I got to my truck the next morning because I felt like I was going to get attacked. Now I've only gone back a few times the last couple of years and I can't shake this feeling of being watched. Nothing has happened yet, but I'm very on edge and I hope nothing else comes from this.
I live in the only house down a country road. Everything else is pasture land and national forest for several miles. At 3 AM, my 3 large dogs go absolutely nuts barking, which sends my husband flying out of bed to check out our livestock, assuming we had coyotes in the yard. Before we could even get our shoes on, we hear muttering on our front porch. He grabs his rifle, and whoever it is starts knocking on the door with no real urgency, but more like a casual visitor. He had my cell phone already dialing the cops, and my husband slid the peephole. A woman around her late 20s, early 30s was standing outside, patiently waiting a few minutes and knocking gently on the door, not fidgeting or nervous nor being aggressive. My husband said, "Ma'am, the cops are on their way. If you need help, they'll be here in just a few minutes, and you're welcome to sit on the swing right there and wait. But if there's anyone there with you, we're armed in here, and will not hesitate to shoot if anyone tries getting into this house." He said that, and she kind of smiled. Not creepy, but like she was glad her knocking woke someone up. "That's okay, sir. I just wanted to let you know that the thing in the woods is coming, and that he'll be here soon. Good luck." He said. She turned around and walked down the driveway, like she didn't have a care in the world. The cops looked all over the place and couldn't find her, and it's a 10-minute drive to our driveway from the main road, with no houses until you get into town, another 20 minutes away, and it freaked me out for weeks.
I grew up in a very rural area in the deep south and spent most of my time riding my horse alone in the national forests and expansive private properties. There was an abandoned house that was about 2 miles ride through the woods from me, and I often rode it by myself on journeys through the woods. Sometimes I tied up my horse outside and went in and explored inside, but there was really nothing of interest. There was just trash and things like electric bills from the 80s. I think an old woman used to live there based on some pictures that I found. Time went on and I went away to college, taking my horse with me. I no longer rode past the abandoned house now. After graduating college, my horse and I moved back to home for a little while. I decided to go back and explore it again. So I rode my horse that same 2 miles through the deep woods to get to this house, which is by itself probably about 1,000 feet from a lonely gravel road that cuts through the forest. It is very secluded and almost creepy. The house is about 3 miles from a paved road. I am less brave than I used to be, so when I entered the home, I felt out of place and slightly scared, but I used my cell phone light to explore the rooms anyway. Now a lot of it was as I remembered, but right as I was about to leave, I found a calf skeleton in the corner of the entry room. I have no idea how this calf got shut up inside the building. The doors were firmly shut as I approached. Also, the screen door opened one way, while the actual door opened the other, so it's impossible for both to be opened at once for some creature to accidentally wander in. Furthermore, the nearest cow pastures are miles away from the home. I left the abandoned house with the image in my head burnt there forever.
We were out hunting with a group of guys. We were all 100 yards from each other. The sun had set, and the darkness was quickly settling in. We called it a night, and I started getting down out of the trees when I heard a twig snap. I froze, thinking it was a deer and not wanting to scare it. After sitting for a few minutes, this blood-curdling howl comes from where the twig snapped. We don't live in an area with wolves, like, at all. We have coyotes, but they don't make the same sound. My phone started blowing up, with the other guy asking if I'd heard it. Yep, it's nearly under my tree. It was so loud I could almost feel it in my chest. After about a half hour of silence, I gathered all my bravery, and I bailed out the tree, armed with a knife, and made my way to the group. We never saw it or heard it again after that. It was one singular howl in an area that doesn't have wolves, on an island we've hunted on for 10 years, and never had anything like that happen. I still haven't quite figured out where it came from, and still get goosebumps from thinking about it.
I was hiking through the remnants of a remote, long-abandoned town and the surrounding area. To get as far into the woods as I was, you had to cross fallen trees over creeks at least 3 times. I had just crossed the 3rd bridge and was about 5 miles in, and something blue caught my eye ahead of me. There was a man in his 60s at least, wearing blue satin pajamas, sitting in a tree. The closer I got to him, the louder he laughed. It wasn't a maniacal laugh, but it set off more than enough alarm bells in my head nevertheless. He wasn't wearing any shoes either, yet he looked well groomed and clean. I gave him a friendly nod as I passed, and he just kept laughing. Then it stopped. I turned and he was gone. There was no branch cracking, plants rustling, leaves disturbed, nothing. He was just gone. I'm a pretty avid backpacker in the PNW. Sometimes I'll hike for days on end without seeing another person. I think it's exhilarating being completely alone. There's truly no feeling like it. You get used to it, but personally, I can never help but be on edge. The environment is completely serene and friendly, but there's a constant feeling in the back of your mind that you can't shake. Most of the time you'll be chugging along, comfortable in your mind, but when you stop for even a moment to fill up on water, you can't help but look over your shoulder. Now nothing bothers me much out in the woods. I've run into brown bears, had elk trample through campsites late at night and much more, but this one night was much different. I was going on a deep backwoods hike. It was in the late fall off season. It was pretty cold, but the snow hadn't quite started falling yet. In fact, I usually plan my trips around this way. The forest ranger I talked to when I organised my trip told me that I was the only hiker she knew of who would be up here at that time. I was using dispersed camping sites so far off the beaten path that they don't even have fire pits. This night it was around 5 or 6 miles from the trail into the area. I set up camp at a site about 100 yards away from a stream, close enough that a faint babble was audible. I'd lit a fire, cooked dinner, and read for a while and was settling down to go to sleep. I laid there listening for the sounds of the woods and just to settle down with the creek. Just as I was nodding off, I started to hear voices. Nothing distant, no clear words, but clearly a group of people having a good time, laughing, and probably telling stories around a campfire. Now a feeling of dread come over me. I thought, I shouldn't leave the tent. Now the fear engulfed me like I've never had it do so before. All of the hairs on my arms, legs and back of my neck stood on end. I laid there in panic for a while, the voices carrying on laughing in the distance. After a while, they receded into the background. I still decided to not leave the tent. I was too afraid. Now the next morning, after a very short night's sleep, I searched the surrounding area and the path to the site. There were a few shoe prints that were faded and worn around the edges, too old to be from the group I'd heard. I tried to shrug it off as nerves, and maybe just the nervousness of it all had got the better of me, but I couldn't shake a certain tension. I made good time to the next site. Now, for the last day of the trip, I looked around a little more than usual. Still nobody to be seen. This site had no stream, it was dry camping and it wasn't a blast, but if you've got enough water for cooking and drinking, it's alright. So it was a lot quieter, just the chirps of bugs and the wind rustling in the trees. I cooked my dinner and stayed up for a good while after dark, sitting on a log, looking at the stars and listening to the sounds of the forest. I was trying to hear the voices before the night started, but there was nothing. I then turned in for the day, stretching out and just laying there. I felt restless though, and it felt like I was laying there for hours. Finally, a calm come over me, but then it's back. No, it wasn't particularly scary what they were saying or threatening. Just like a group of maybe 20 people having a good time, barely audible above the background noise. This time I'm calm, and there seems to be like an internal dialogue in the back of my mind. Why not join them? Sounds like they're having fun. No, I'd rather stay here. No, really. This is entirely unconscious and goes on for a while. I've never experienced anything like this. I was worried that I'd lost it. After a while though, the noises eventually faded away into the night, and I felt that I was alone. The next day I packed as quickly as I could and got the hell out of there. During the day, I was much more at ease, like I'd always been in the past. I was relieved when I got back to the car and started home. Now I told the story a few times, and every time that I recite it, a little feeling of dread arises like I felt on that night. I really had no reason to feel strongly about what happened, but I do. Now on this one occasion, I told my teacher, who's a Native American. He got quiet for a minute and then said that I ran into stick Indians. He said it was good that I didn't leave the tent. Stick Indians are evil and dangerous and prey on those who are vulnerable or alone. The look on his face was sober. He told me not to go back to that place again, and these spirits are extremely aggressive and attack at the slightest provocation. He was very scared that I got that close to them and didn't realise, but he knew that the fear I felt was real, and that it was good because it probably protected me. Now whenever this subject comes up, I feel true fear inside. As I write this thousands of miles from the site, my arms are still quaking. I'm in the army, and while training in Germany, our platoon was sitting on a screen line conducting an area reconnaissance mission. During the night, the guy on guard heard somebody bang 3 times on the left side of the Bradley. That doesn't make sense because you need another large metal object to make such a loud noise. Less than 5 seconds later, he heard the same 3 knocks again on the top of the turret. A few seconds pass, and a high-pitched tone comes through our headset with 3 knocks on the back door of the Bradley, along with somebody screaming, "Let me in, let me in." This wakes me and the other one up, and we go and open the door thinking it's somebody in our platoon who is trying to get in touch with us. Now there was only complete darkness. We waited about 30 seconds, geared up, checked a 50-meter semicircle around us and found nothing. We get back inside and every single fault light in the turret is on with some blinking, and they never blink. The radios were completely dead. We restarted the turret and everything worked fine. I called over the net to see if anybody else was in our area, and nobody was. The next day we asked our OCs, who are essentially referees, and nobody thought anything happened that night. Shortly thereafter, we discovered an old tank half buried and rusted out near our position. I was camping in upstate New York for about 2 weeks after 2 prisoners escaped. This was a highly notifiable escape and was national news. My girlfriend and I had hiked and camped for 2 days before this. We were very comfortable and met a lot of awesome people, but everybody was on alert because of the escapees. Now we had settled in a remote area upstate in New York that nobody was around during night. So I was sound asleep that night at about 5:30 AM. Now I had started to wake but stayed in my state of sleep, laying there in the tent, not trying to wake up my girlfriend. I knew that I didn't want to wake up for another 2 hours or so. Now not long after I was slightly awoken, I heard rustling in the woods around our campsite. It started out as just a few rustles, which caught my attention, but nothing to be alarmed by. Maybe it's just animals. Suddenly, the rustles are right outside my tent and I'm really on edge. Before I could even tap my girlfriend, all hell breaks loose. The tent is slashed open with a knife while I'm watching. My heart almost went through my throat. Before I knew what was happening, I was being pole-driven to the ground by men with guns. Thankfully, I noticed in the seconds of panic that the men had police armour on. I started screaming out my name, address, social security number, everything. My girlfriend was even jumped on and forcefully subdued while she was sleeping. Now, once everyone's adrenaline calmed down, we showed our IDs and proved that we were just camping. It turns out that we weren't even sleeping far away from where the escapees were spotted. This was easily the most scary moment of my life. About 10 years ago when I was in the Navy, we were 100 miles away from any land. It was about 3 or 4 AM off the coast of Peru. I was an electronics technician that worked in the radio station with the other guy, a radio man, and we just sat up there scanning on HF, UHF and VHF radio stations listening for drug runners. We then intercepted a UHF signal that played a short piano, followed by a haunting woman's voice saying the following numbers: 11, 9, 4, 6, etc. This went on for about a minute. Then it would repeat the same sentence, followed by more weird piano sounds. We recorded the transmission, wrote the numbers down, then informed the captain, and shortly after a message was sent off to the area commander about the strange message. The reply we received was, "Disregard." That creeped the hell out of me. I later found out that this is a numbers station, and while this is not entirely understood, it's likely a method of getting secret codes out to intelligence agents in the field. Either way, it's creepy as hell. Imagine intercepting that at 4 AM in the middle of nowhere, having no idea what it is or what it means. Now, in short, in college, I spent 1 month house-sitting a large hunting estate in the middle of nowhere in Idaho. The nearest town was 22 miles away. I woke up in the middle of the night to the sound of somebody knocking loud and hard on the front door, and the dogs were going crazy. No way I was going to answer it. I just grabbed the gun and kept quiet upstairs and went back to sleep. The next morning that I went down, there was a car in the driveway. The guy who owned the car was found dead several months later. Now, here's everything I know and what I experienced that night. It was June 1987. I know it was 87 because it is the season after the Bill Buckner baseball disaster. My girlfriend's parents owned the place. It was in Etty, Idaho. I won't say exactly what town it is 22 miles from because they might still own it and I don't want them to get more weird things after this. Now, it was a pretty big place. There was a lot of acreage. The guy who was a full-time caretaker for the place had just quit. My girlfriend's dad had just went out there to find a new caretaker, but the new caretaker couldn't start for a month. Her dad offered to pay me $1,200 to go out there, free food, satellite TV, and free booze. All I had to do was keep an eye on the place and feed the dogs and the horse. Now, I'd never actually been west, so I took him up on it. It sounded better than doing landscaping. I spent the time reading and exploring, playing with the dogs, riding the horse, shooting. Now, it was completely uneventful except for one night. That night, after the knocking stopped and the dogs stopped barking, I eventually went back to sleep. I didn't freak out that much because I knew that there were 2 German shepherds inside with me and I had a gun. I kept it on the nightstand. Now, I'd been drinking a little, but not a drunk mess by any means. There were several neighbours that were a few miles away. I was kind of thinking somebody just simply drove up the wrong way. The next morning I go down, there's a white Chevy Nova sitting in the driveway. It was near the small cabin for the caretaker. The cabin was about 100 yards away from the main house. I called my girlfriend's dad and asked him if he knew anybody with that car model and make, and told him about what happened the night before. He didn't know anyone and he called the police directly. Now, the police did show up, and they asked me a few questions and walked around the property for about an hour or so. The car was locked, the police had to tow it. I have no idea if it was broken down or not. There were also tyre tracks going to the house but not from it. A few days later, my girlfriend's dad called me up to say the guy who owned the car was missing and to call the police if anything weird happened. I have no idea who the guy was at all. Don't know how long he was missing or when he was reported missing, or who reported him that way. He was just gone, and my girlfriend's dad didn't know too much. After 1 month I went back home. My girlfriend and I broke up shortly after. I saw her out on town several months later. I asked her if she ever found out what happened to that guy. All she knows is that the guy was found dead by suicide 30 miles away. The suicide happened several months after that incident at the house, and he was found a couple of days after he killed himself. I asked her how he did it, where he was found, who found him, etc., and I got nothing. I never saw her again after. When I was 15, I was at a Boy Scout camp in Illinois. My tent mate was sick, so he went home on Tuesday. So Wednesday night, I was alone in my tent when I heard thuds, between 10 and 12 a minute. I thought little of it and went back to sleep. Tuesday night, alone again. I needed to go to the bathroom at about 1 AM. So I make it to the latrine, and behind me, I started hearing thuds, like somebody's chopping wood with a troop's axe at 1 in the morning. Someone who then stops, looks directly at me, then walks away into the woods. Now I've never been so scared in my life. Now as they turned to go away from me, they began laughing. Not only that, I heard more laughing later that night. I reported it to the camp staff and they did an investigation, which revealed that others had heard what I had and even seen the same thing. To this day, 5 years later, nobody knows anything about this person, what they were doing, or why they were out there. It was confirmed to be not a camper or staff member. That's literally all that's known about it. I lived on a compound by myself. I know it sounds odd, but it's really my tiny home, workshop and a couple of other buildings for food and storage equipment and a guest room all rolled into one. Now during one really bad snowstorm, my area OOC was knocked out, so I decided to hunker in for the long haul. I spent almost 2 weeks without leaving there. 3 days in, I get woken up to a knock at the door. I get up to answer it, and halfway there, I realise the only way that this guy could knock on my door is if he broke the lock. So I grab my shotgun, ask him through the door who he is and what he wants. The guy says nothing and keeps on banging. I go to the back door and sneak around and see who it is. I then see a man lying on the ground, covered in blood, and shouting quietly for help. It turns out that he was driving, crashed, and dragged himself 5 miles down the road until he come upon my place. By then, he realised that I forgot to lock the bottom part of the gate and wrestled in. Luckily, he survived. I lived in Germany for many years while my father was stationed there. He was in the US Army. We lived off base in private housing and I loved it. It was amazing where we stayed. Now I quickly become really good friends with some of the local boys whose parents owned the town's dairy farm. We were always in the forest running around exploring, fishing, playing army, etc. I was only around 9 at the time. I'm 37 now. So one night, I stayed late at the farm hanging with the guys. We left at about 9 or 10ish. It was dark, but the moonlight gave me pretty good night vision as I remember it. I lived just across a soccer field and on a small cornfield from the farm. As I'm walking across the soccer field, I see a bit of movement ahead of me, just real quick from the corner of my eye along the tree line at the edge of the field. I quickly step up my pace. I turn to take my usual path through the cornfield to my house. I see at least half a dozen silhouette figures emerging from each side of the rows of corn on each side of the path. I froze so hard, I just stand there. Then, there's one behind me. Before I can snap around and haul ass, he asks in German where I was going. I then quickly turn around, and what I see surprises me, but also relieves me. I answered in English and told him that I was heading home. He was curious about my English. Now, it turns out that he was a team of special forces. I mean, these guys were decked out in so much tactical gear. They had night vision goggles, packs, bags, weapons. There was even a dog, and the dog wasn't barking like it was really well trained. Now, they were using these small towns off of bases to do some training or something. It just happened upon that this particular night, I saw them. I don't know why they chose to break cover and show themselves. I'm just thankful that they weren't too angry at me, and it wasn't anyone else who greeted me in the dark. My father-in-law used to live in rural Australia, about an hour from the closest town in a little valley with 3 other houses. Through winter time, he was the only house that was occupied. My daughter and I would visit quite often and stay over the weekends, or at least look after the place for the dogs if he had to go away. Aside from the usual snakes and giant lizards, the dogs wouldn't normally bark unless somebody was on the property. Now I woke up alone one night, in the dead of winter, and all 4 of the dogs were going mad and circling the house. I figured it was just something on the property, like an animal, and they would go out to chase it. I then walked out onto the deck and looked down onto the enclosed yard, just in time to see the dogs run around the corner of the house at the fence line. No big deal, they're probably chasing an animal away. I leaned on the railing of the fence just to make sure and wait for them to come back again. I'll point out that the fence is made of thick log posts, with one log across on top of the other, and the empty spaces covered with chicken wire. So I'm up there watching the opposite corner of the fence for the dogs' next pass, as I can hear them coming, and most of that side is obscured by trees and lilac bushes. Now whatever they were chasing, it was not an animal. It was too big. It looked like a person on all 4s. Now, long is the only word I can use to describe it. It was running along the top of the fence, panting like the dogs were. Now, these dogs were pretty quick and actually quite smart. I've watched them repeatedly take down animals that got too close to us before. But whatever this thing was, it was quicker than the dogs were. Now, I don't know why, but I was terrified. I couldn't move away or stop watching it. Now the dogs kept on following it, passing the fence again, until it eventually jumped off the fence onto the opposite side from where the dogs were, into the open paddock, and it just squatted there looking. At first it was just staring at the dogs, but then it tilted its head up and looked to where I was standing. It wasn't light enough to see its face, just that its head had moved. Once it saw me, it bolted off into the trees, still on all 4s and faster than a person could move, especially in that position. I brought in all of the dogs after that, and they slept with me for the night, but I don't know, it was terrifying. This took place during the summer of '93. I was living in Montana, but had a boyfriend in British Columbia. I often travelled between the 2 places. We were broke and careless, so we hitchhiked when we needed to get somewhere further than biking distance. I had spent the month of August with him in BC, and eventually it was time to go back to school. I, of course, not having worked much all summer, had no money. My bum-ass boyfriend couldn't come through with the money either, even for a bus ticket. My parents were mad at me, so they weren't giving me any money. All my friends were broke, but we didn't have cell phones to call them anyway. Now we were living in a 2-room cabin with no running water in the mountains. The only phone was a party line that belonged to the neighbours that was basically only there for emergencies. The decision was made. I was already 2 days late for school, and I didn't feel like panhandling for a bus ticket. I had to get back and couldn't wait for my boyfriend's money to materialise. I would be doing my hitchhiking alone. I then filled up my backpack with all the stuff I needed, making sure I had my ID, because one time we hitchhiked to the border, left Canada, tried to get into the US before I realised that I left my ID in Canada, meaning I had no ID to enter the US. I also had no ID to get back into Canada, but that's a story for another day. Things went surprisingly smoothly for the majority of the trip. An elderly couple picked me up as soon as I got off the mountain and took me into town, all the way to Cranston, right near the border crossing. I walked across and was picked up almost immediately by a guy who gave me the first creepy vibes. But all he did was lecture me about how dangerous it is to hike alone, and how much I reminded him of his daughter. He taught me way to Kua, DNA, ID, which is nearly half of the trip. I was having phenomenal luck, to be honest. I then walked outside to the city limits and stuck my thumb out. 1 hour went by, then 2. You'd often walk really slowly when you're trying to catch a ride, and eventually, I come across a small flap of cardboard. I picked it up thinking that I could walk off at the next exit, borrow a marker at a gas station, make a sign, and maybe that's going to help me. So I'm walking along a little faster now, and suddenly I see something moving in my peripheral vision. I tense, look and see it's a 2-foot thin, dark snake trying to get over the cement guardrail. Now he was never going to make it over. He was kind of trying to throw himself over it sideways. I happen to like snakes and he looked pretty harmless. I then used my sign as a shovel to throw him over. I now realise in hindsight that this was a bad omen. Before I could reach the next car, a car slowed down to a stop. It's always creepy when a car stops and you're walking up to it trying to judge if it's Ted Bundy or just someone eccentric like you. My heart always sunk a little. I knew it would just be a single man, but I soon realised that he wasn't alone. There was a kid in the front seat who looked about 10 or 13. The guy was a little too friendly, but what are you gonna do? Murder me in front of the kid? I decided to get in. Now it turned out that the man was pretty chatty, introducing the kid as his nephew. He said they were driving back from where they lived in St. Louis from visiting his brother in Seattle, so the kid could visit his grandma. Now the kid never said a word. If I remember correctly, it being a very long time ago, it was about 3 hours to where I lived from Coat. He was taking Highway 90 right over the city I lived in, so I was relieved that I wouldn't have to get out of the car and thumb it again. The first hour goes by, and it's a friendly chit-chat, lots of family anecdotes and generally small talk. The switchblade my boyfriend gave me was cradled in the bottom of my palm the whole time, up my sleeve out of view, though I did begin to tense up a little bit. Now he kept up the friendly chatter, but eventually the questions he was asking took a racier turn, like do I have a boyfriend, what was he like, and other weird stuff. I silently panicked. This guy is a creep after all. The questions were getting more and more weird. My instinct was to play along with the conversation while I figured out what to do. I was pretty sure the drink he had in the console had more than pop in it. Basically, you could see him physically getting looser at the wheel as he went on. He kept asking gross questions. I was embarrassed for his nephew, but played along. I just kept on breathing deeply to try and not have a panic attack. Eventually, he made it clear that he expected some favours from me for the ride. At this point, we're about 20 minutes away from where I lived. I had to keep going along with it. Now, I put on my best come-highter smile and said to him, "You know what, I bet she's home now. Let's go straight over to her place and we can get this started," talking about one of my friend's apartments. Now, I had him get off at my exit and asked him if we could get some beer for our first date. Now in Montana, you can buy beer at gas stations, so I had him stop at a place a few blocks from where I lived. When I somewhat reluctantly went inside to buy a beer, which I knew was in the back of the store, as I opened my door, I literally sprinted straight down an alley and around a block and dove into a huge clump of bushes, folding myself up as tightly as possible. I still had my knife, but I know it was out of my sleeve now. I was shaking, my heart was pounding like it's going to explode. I tucked my head into my knees and waited, listening for his car coming down the alley. When we got to the gas station, it was about 4 PM in September. There was plenty of light out. I stayed in those bushes until night fell and then finally sprinted home. I never heard his car come down the alley again. I could hear him yelling for me. He sounded pissed. I got to my front door, locked the deadbolt and collapsed. Dirt and little leaves all over me. It was the most terrifying thing that's happened to me. I never hitchhiked again after. I live in an old little place in Appalachia that was supposedly carved out of the mountains by a meteor. There is a 360-degree view of mountains around me at all times. Well, when I was in middle school, I got really into mountain biking. So because of my age, and my mum not wanting me to be on some random mountain path that nobody had went on for months, she wouldn't let me go deep into any trail. She would only let me go deep on the trail when I had a guy with me who owned a bike shop, who was also a co-worker as she was a teacher. Well, it had been months since I'd started doing weekly rides with this guy Joe, and a few other guys he rode up with. We went to this place called Lake Hill, as it was the road to the city's water supply, which had a lake-sized natural spring. Now one day, we'd been riding for hours, like daybreak to probably an hour before dark. We just got to the point where we were going to turn around when we crest this hill and bam, there's a dude there, just standing there, wearing camo gear, a yellow raincoat in the middle of summer, standing about 15 feet away from our four-wheeler. He has a shotgun in his hand. Now Joe, who was the most athletic out of all of us, was in front of me, and I think I'd gotten behind him where the two younger guys were behind too. When you're pedaling a mountain bike up a steepish hill, you're not really looking forward, you're looking down at the ground. You're studying where your wheel is going to make sure you don't hit anything that's going to make you lose your momentum. So as it happened, I ran into the back of Joe and I was kind of annoyed. I looked up sharply and saw Joe positioning himself between me and the dude. The man said nothing, not a single word. Not a word of comfort or compassion, despite the fact that he'd just run up on us with a shotgun. Now you don't see strangers anywhere in deserted places like this. Now I've played these events through my head countless times and this is what I think was happening. The guy probably thought, these guys have run up on me harvesting my pot. What if they tell the cops? Can I afford to take the chance? I don't know, there's a few of them. Wow, there's a kid too. Now because I could see an edge of tension bleed out of his face when he looked at me, I swear it was him deciding to kill Joe, then deciding not to kill me. Now Joe, to his credit, positioned himself between the man and me the whole time. Eventually, the guy just hopped on his four-wheeler, covered in plants, and rode away. I will never forget the taste of exhaustion and adrenaline as we come off that hill. Now luckily, I never saw him again since, and I still get that same sense of adrenaline just recounting that story like now. I spent 3 months in northwestern Utah in 1999 doing graduate field work. I was alone for almost all of it. I read Lord of the Rings, played guitars, laid in the dirt staring up at the stars. It was all very fun. Anyhow, one night I was sleeping, I heard strange noises. At around 3 AM, it jolted me awake instantly. I was in a tent and about 30 feet away from me, I heard a really loud grunt that lasted for about 4 seconds. Maybe it was an animal clearing its throat, I thought. Most alarmingly though, it definitely had an aggressive tone to it. It sounded like a challenge. There were no bears in that area, but mountain lions were possible, although very rare. Now I sat upright straight away and grabbed my flashlight. I had no weapons with me other than a small knife that was used for the cooking gear. I waited, quiet as a mouse, for about 30 seconds, listening for any noise at all. It was dead quiet. I dreaded it. I couldn't hear anything, but never said a single word. As quietly as I could, but it sounded like when you're opening a bag of chips and you're trying not to make any sound. I positioned myself at the zipper of the tent, then suddenly yanked it open with a flashlight. Nothing. Then I bolted for the truck about 50 yards away. I made it and looked around with the flashlight. Still nothing. I figured that it was out there watching me, unless it ran away when I ran to the truck. Now I had the window crack a bit and watched and listened for about an hour. I heard nothing. I lay back in the seat and tried to sleep, but it was actually quite chilly and I was only wearing some light clothing. Now the next morning, I looked for tracks and again saw nothing. For the next 6 or so weeks, I slept in the back of the truck. Now the sound I heard was similar to that of a cougar, but I'm still not sure what it was to this day. Cop here. Anyone want a story? About 9 years ago, we got a call from a payphone. There's a dead body in an abandoned building at... An officer responds to the area and can't find anything that would be considered an abandoned building. The caller hung up without leaving any information, and the payphone that he had called from was several miles away from the area. The officer clears out the call, having no contact. The next day, we get another phone call from another payphone. There's a dead body inside the abandoned building at... And again, they hang up without offering any information. This time, I get dispatched to the report. I head up to the area of that intersection and start looking around. Now I understand that I live and work in a fairly sizable metropolitan area, and this was when the economy was still good, booming even. Abandoned buildings were really hard to come by at the time. I drive through all the shopping plaza and I find a little industrial complex within the vicinity of the intersection. I decided just to drive a little further. I remembered that there's some new construction that hasn't been finished yet, and I wonder if they think that these are considered abandoned. I get out of my car and walk through a bunch of businesses that are still in farming stages. I can't find anything. As I leave the area, I'm now more than a mile away from the call location. As I pull onto the major roadway, I stop for traffic and look in front of me. There it is, a gigantic electrical component factory that's been vacant for at least 15 years probably. It has a 9-foot wall around the entire perimeter and the landscaping is still maintained. That's why it didn't really stick out like a sore thumb. That added to the fact that I'm pretty far away from where the caller said it should be, but then again, it's abandoned. It's definitely abandoned and been so for a long time, so I call for another unit to back me up and we go check it out. We use a drainage pipe to climb up and over the 9-foot wall to get inside the perimeter. We started walking inside the building, checking every single door. When I say this building's big, I mean it's freaking gigantic. It's over 100,000 square feet. It's like an old abandoned Motorola or Freescale or Intel type building. It has gigantic coolers on the outside, pipes running all over the place, ductwork running all over the sides of the building, loading docks and a basement. Every door we come across is locked and secured. We continued walking around looking for anything that's out of place. I get about 3/4 of the way around the building, I pull on a door and it flings open. I call my backup who comes over to me. We knock, announcing into the building. As we step into the hallway that leads about 100 yards down with doors on either side, the door we stepped into closes. It's black, pitch black, like I can't even see my nose or my face. We started moving through the building, trying to clear each room the best 2 of us can, but this place is huge. Each room is connected to what seems like 4 other rooms. We step into one room and the door closes behind us. It must have been some old clean room or something like that. It was the weirdest thing because there was no sound. Nothing. I couldn't even hear the traffic outside or the grumble of electricity or air moving even. All the sounds that we heard throughout the rest of the building were gone into this one room. When I spoke to my partner, our voices didn't even echo. It must have been some kind of old sound cancelling installation or something. It freaked us out. The floor had 12-inch holes in it. This led into the basement, which was flooded by over 6 feet of water, wire, ceiling panels and wire jacketing, which was just hanging from the ceiling. There was broken glass, broken pieces of metal and brick, holes in the drywall, and abandoned equipment everywhere. I can clearly remember thinking to myself that if there was ever a time that we're going to be attacked by skinless zombie dogs, this would be it. The entire time that we're in here, we're trying to find a dead body. We ended up moving through the building, clearing it as best we could until we get to what was definitely in the industrial part of the building. Gigantic boilers, evaporative coolers, and components that run throughout the building. Oh, and spiders. Tons of them. We stepped into a room and find that it's dead-ended. We've reached the end of the building and we don't have any further to go. This room is about 20 feet by 30 and it contains very large electrical cabinets. They're about 8 feet tall and 4 feet wide. They're sitting next to each other and they look exactly how I would design the lab of an evil genius if I had to make one like out of a sci-fi film. The entire thing was covered in dials, levers, red and green buttons, but the only panel in the middle was illuminated. It had one steady glowing red light on it, the first and only light that we actually saw throughout the entire building. My partner calls out to me, "You got anything?" "Nah, nothing in here." Looks like this was a gigantic waste of time. Just let me take a look behind these cabinets and we'll go back to our cars. Now the panels have about 18 to 24 inches of room on each one and between them and on the wall behind them. So I look over the wall to the left side and peek my head round. Bam. There he is, a dead guy on the ground, pinned between the wall and the electrical cabinet. The way that he's pressed up means that his arms are in front of him and pushed out from his chest like he's a T-Rex. I nearly shot him, not gonna lie. He scared the life out of me. Even though I spent the last hour actively looking for him, I still wasn't completely ready for it. So skip ahead calling detectives, etc. At the time, dripping copper wire was fairly new, at least to our area. I didn't recognise what the wire jacketing meant. I hadn't seen it before. These two knuckleheads had broken into this abandoned factory for God knows how long and systematically begun stripping out the entire place of every bit of metal that it had. And they made their way to the very last room, the only one that still had power run into it. See, the middle panel, you controlled the fire suspension system for the building, and the owner's insurance policy required that it remained actively on. When these guys opened up the panels, they must have thought they hit the mother lode. Each one contained 1.5 inch copper cable. Now, 1.5 inch of copper cable is worth quite a lot of money, but it also conducts a hell of a lot of electricity. They cut through the first one successfully, leaving the sharp ends exposed inside the cabinet, but when this poor sab started cutting through the second one, he got the shock of his life. Not only did he electrocute himself, but the current coursing through his arms pulled his chest into the cabinet. Not only that, his chest would have went straight into the exposed wire, cutting him, killing him instantly. We went to an apartment which was a local drug den. A female we knew called and said that the male renter had been assaulted and she had run. We got there and the door was bolted shut. I kicked the door over and over again and it wouldn't budge. What I found out later is that the dope team had done a search warrant on the apartment a couple of weeks earlier, and thereafter they had reinforced the door with a metal plate. It took me a total of 22 kicks before the door finally broke. The deadbolt went flying in two across the room and hit the wall. We made entry, guns drawn, and started clearing the entire apartment. Now this place is the kind of spooky that I've only seen in places where meth is done. It was dark, there were swastikas, 666, upside down pentagrams, etc. all painted on the wall. Pictures of faces hung on the wall with the eyes X'd out, baby dolls with their eyes scratched out into X's. Now as we cleared the first room, we started seeing the blood, first on the bed, then a trail leading to the back room. The layout was weird. It was really odd. There was one main room, then a back room which was more of a hallway to a bathroom and the end of that hall. We followed the trail of blood from the hall into the bathroom. In front of the door was the renter's dog, which was shaking uncontrollably and very scared. As we got closer, it became aggressive. I made my way all the way round the dog and entered the bathroom, where I found the renter hunched over in the shower, bleeding from his face, holding his cheeks with his hands. He was frantically trying to talk, pleading with us not to hurt his dog. Blood was coming from his mouth and I couldn't understand him. Then I saw the extent of what had happened to him. His jaw had been dislocated on both sides as he was beaten by two men with a hammer. His jaw was literally just hanging there, and he was just trying to plead with us, but he could only do so by flicking his tongue about a bit and tried desperately to get words out. When I was 11, I moved to a rather big city due to my dad getting transferred at his work. Before that, I lived in a relatively small town known for its smelly garbage dump. I love that town, with all my heart, I really do. I still love it to this day, but this experience shattered my childhood illusion that it was safe and nothing bad could ever happen with anyone. I lived in a very close-knit neighbourhood where all the parents knew each other and all of the kids were friends. At the end of my street has a small, half-built house that's all to become the neighbourhood hangout. It's been abandoned since its construction for unknown reasons. It sat there for nearly 2 years before all of us decided that it was a perfect clubhouse. All of the kids would walk home from school together, tell their parents that they were going to go hang out there, and just go head down to the house. So on one Saturday, I walked across the street to my friend's house and asked if she wanted to go to the clubhouse with me. She said she was eating lunch, but she'd meet me there as soon as she was done with that. I was only 7 at the time, but my parents trusted me enough not to get into any trouble or run off somewhere, so I headed down there to wait. I was sitting on the front steps of the house when a white car with very dark tinted windows pulled up to the curb. To my young mind, it looked exactly like a police car, just without any lights on, so I thought they were undercover. The driver of the car rolled down the passenger side window and leaned over his seat. I could see he was wearing a policeman's uniform and aviator sunglasses. He waved me over, not wanting to make the cop angry. I decided just to approach the passenger side of the car. "Hey there, do you think you can help me with something?" he asked me. He seemed nice enough. I said, "Yeah, I'll try." He went on to show me a picture of a little girl that I'd never seen before and asked me if I knew her. I shook my head. He then told me that she was missing and her parents really missed her and wanted her back, and he was having a lot of trouble finding her. Now at this point, my friend from earlier had showed up. The guy asked Anna, who is my friend, if she had seen the little girl, but she hadn't either. He then seemed to get really sad and shook his head. "I just really wish I could find her. Do you want to help me look? If you get in my car, we can drive around and see if we can all find her." To me that sounded awesome. I threw all notions of stranger danger out of the window. I'd never been in a cop car before and thought I'd have the time of my life, but Anna, she seemed to be a lot more cautious and have her head on right that day. She politely declined. This visibly upset him and he got really angry, telling us that he'd arrest us if we didn't get into the car and help. Anna and I both started freaking out and we then booked it to my home. The guy then reached into his glove box and pulled out a small set of handcuffs. He sped off as soon as we started running though. At this point we're both crying, but managed to get to my home and tell my mum everything that happened. She immediately called the police, who asked if they had an officer patrolling our area. They didn't. And then the real cops showed up to my house and asked me and Anna a ton of questions, and I realised that the scary guy's uniform was way off. They tried to get a description from us, but he was wearing a hat and sunglasses, so it made it hard to see a lot of his face. We, however, given a pretty good description of the little girl. As far as I know, nothing ever happened to that guy. The description we gave of the little girl didn't match any missing people claims within a 100-mile radius of our town. This is a story my friend told me that happened to her older sister. She goes to a large, private religious university in Utah. She was staying in an apartment not too far from the campus with 3 other girls. That semester, they had just started and 2 of the 3 girls were asleep. Now at the time, my friend's sister was on the phone, sitting in the living room when she heard what sounded like footsteps outside the window, literally right behind her. She listened really closely, but dismissed it as a stray cat or a dog. Soon after, she heard a thud against the dining room wall coming from the outside. After that, she heard what sounded like a muffled whispering. My friend's sister is an excellent marksman, so she decided to scare whoever it was outside by opening the blinds, turning on the lights and grabbing the shotgun that she kept on the mantelpiece and pointing it at the window while screaming for the other girl to get up. She then saw a short man, wearing all black and a ski mask, running away. The cops come shortly after and she filed a report. Now fast forward to a few weeks later. My friend's sister kept seeing a small white truck with tinted out windows following her. She dismissed it as her own imagination, but she started to get a little scared by this. One weekend, her roommates had gone out of town, so she was just by herself. Right as she's trying to fall asleep, she hears a pounding at the door again. She bolts to the door and looks through the peephole to see a cop standing there. "Who are you?" she called out to them. "I'm a cop," says the guy. Then, "Open up, it's the law," he says more menacingly. My friend is really scared now. She's worried to disobey him in case he actually is a cop, but what if he's not? "Why are you here so late?" she asks. "Remember a few weeks ago when the guy tried to break into your home? I have an update on him." My friend is now freaking out, because why would a cop come and try and talk to her about the case so late and by himself? He wasn't even the officer who helped her fill out the report. "Show me your badge," she demanded. He then quickly produced a badge and shoved it into the peephole. My friend sighed a breath of relief. Right as she is unlocking the door, she glanced down to his legs and noticed this cop had very elevated platform boots, a machete on his unity belt, and the name on his uniform didn't match the name on the badge. "You're not a cop," she yelled at him. The fake cop started screaming and slamming on the door, saying, "I am an officer of the law and you will obey me. Open up now." She then dialed 911 and held her weight behind the door, clutching her shotgun. The guy was gone long before the police could arrive, but he left behind his cab, which was a prop from a party store. To this day, my friend broke her lease, moved to a new city, and transferred to a new school. They never caught that guy. I went to a welfare check. A neighbour called in saying that he hadn't seen this guy for a few days and the lights had been on for a while now. I go and look around and find no footprints or tyre marks in the snow from the recent storm. I check the garage and find nothing. I checked the house, which was unlocked, and found the guy's cell phone, keys, wallet and cash with his TV on. That's when I realised this was now a dead body search. I looked everywhere in and outside of the house and around the garage. Now there were some old vehicles out in the garage, but again, I looked but I couldn't find any tyre marks anywhere. There was no shoe prints either. I call recent numbers on his phone and nobody's heard from him. Only so much I can do now is issue a BOL and we started getting NCIC paperwork ready. The next day, the shift officer goes over to follow up. Turns out, the guy was ploughing his driveway and either had a medical condition or something and passed out or died on the spot and crashed a truck into the other junk cars, which eventually caught on fire. This left only a pile of bones in the front seat covered in snow. I felt terrible for not finding him that night, but it was really creepy knowing that I was literally just inches away from him like this. I am an intern with the Sheriff's Police Department, so most of my time is spent out on patrol. We got called out to do a wellness check, which the deputy thought was going to be a piece of cake, like maybe she went out of town or something. When we get there, we're met by the neighbours who told us that the mail is piling up. The box hasn't been touched for ages and there's untouched packages on the porch. Okay, so we get up to the house. The front door is unsecured, so we crack open the door a couple of inches and the deputy calls inside, but the door won't move anymore. The house was one of those that split where the stairs meet the front door and the upstairs and downstairs are offset, so we concluded there might be stuff behind the door. It's about this time that the deputy tells me that she is a known hoarder and that's why the door could have been stuck this way. He also mentions to me that if we see flies on the insides of the window, then she's probably deceased. As we walk round to the side of the house, We noticed that there are flies on the windows. The back door was locked, and we looked in and we noticed bags upon bags of garbage, diapers and mist all over the place. We head to the back and then the front and attempt to make an entry. He pushes the door open, this time with more force. I manage to squeeze quite hard and we look down, and from underneath we see a grease-like liquid spreading out from under the floor. The deputy stops, closes the door and calmly tells me that the lady has passed away. It's more than likely that she's wedged behind the door. From the dates and the packages, we concluded that she's been gone for about 2 months. Once we did make entry to the house, I was allowed inside. It was very nasty to see her laying like that. Now the thing that really got into me is wondering though if she had fallen down those stairs and died, unable to move and waiting for help that would never come. I was new on the force and sent to a home invasion in progression late at night. I noticed my training officer didn't seem too concerned and responded slowly as opposed to normally urgent. Now upon arrival, he asked me if I had been to a home invasion before. After I said no, he told me that I could go handle the call. As I walked towards the home, the garage opened up and an elderly lady was bent over at a 90-degree angle as her waist hobbled out. Without looking at me, she said to hurry due to the fact that the 2 black male suspects were in her home. I then noticed that she didn't have the ability to be able to stand up straight, and she was partly off. I then walked into the home with her behind me. While my eyes were adjusting to the interior, I heard a click. I turned to find the lady locking 2 pads on the interior door. I then noticed as we were in the kitchen that every cabinet and pantry also had a secure lock on it. I looked down the hallway and found that every interior door of the house was shut with padlocks. I followed the elderly woman down the hall and to the second door on the left. She began to unlock the padlocks and shouted, "They're in here." To my surprise, within the room there was an older white guy sitting at the table using a desktop computer. He looked at me, greeted me. He then identified himself as a woman's husband, and then that whatever he was doing, he went back to it. The woman then pointed at an empty chair and began to yell, "They're under the chair. Oh no, they just ran outside there, quick." She was now pointing to a wall. After then waiting for the woman to lock her husband back into the room, and then waiting for her to let me out of the room, I cursed my training officer and hightailed out of there. Now this was my first exposure to mental illness and it was creepy. My officer then told me that she had been attacked by 2 young males years back, which caused her to have a mental breakdown, and every so often she thinks she sees them again. This happened a couple of years ago when I was backpacking in Australia. I travelled around driving a van. Like many backpackers there do, it saved a lot of money with accommodation. I usually slept in rest areas, gas stations or wherever I could park. This one night in particular, I'd been driving around for a few hours and started to feel sleepy. I decided then to stop in the next resting area, in the middle of nowhere. The parking in that location during daytime could be a great idea, but at night it seemed like a horror movie set. There were no cars parked anywhere. I know, I should have went to where people were, but I was really drowsy. There were no lights on whatsoever. I turned the engine off and closed the curtains of the van. It wasn't too long before dawn that I heard some heavy knocking on the side of the van. "Open up, it's the police." Nothing wakes you up faster than that. My heart was racing. I was just adjusting to the adrenaline rush in my system when they repeated the heavy knocking, saying again that it is the police. My first thought is that I parked somewhere that I shouldn't, but then again, it was in the middle of nowhere and it was a rest area. Before opening up, with my mind telling me that the situation was weird, I decided to go slowly to one of the windows and look through the gap in the curtains. I could clearly see the shape and shadow of the guy standing beside the van. His car wasn't too far off, but it didn't have any lights or flashing lights on. The guy was definitely not fed. Bringing up the courage I had, I shouted, "Go away, I have a gun and I'm calling the cops. They're on the radio to me now." I didn't have a radio or gun. Didn't seem to faze him though. I saw him go back to his car. To add to the creepiness, somebody jumped out of the bushes and rushed back into the same car. They left, and a few minutes later after that, I turned on my van and drove in the opposite direction they went. Safe to say that I never slept in another rest area that didn't have at least a couple of other people there. I don't know what those people wanted, but with Australia's history of backpacking serial killers, I'm very happy to say that I got away. The creepiest thing I found was a guy who passed away, but not just your average guy. This guy died on his couch, surrounded by no less than 1,500ml cans. Plus he had no friends or family at all, sadly. None. He was retired, and his electric bill was auto deducting from his checking accounts. He died on his couch, and nobody realised it for 6 months. We then found him. The top was completely skeletonized, but the bottom, that half was still rotten. So he was half skeleton, half rotten. It was really creepy and sad though that he was left there for so long and nobody realised, and he was gone and forgotten. I spent my first year as a constable in an inner city suburb of Queensland. Now, of the population of this area, something like 40% was reserved for government commissioned housing for rehabilitated criminals and persons released from mental health centres. So here was a share of the creepy stuff, but to be fair, for the most part, the people we dealt with were more like cartoon characters. So there was this one guy. I met him probably just minutes before he decided to go on his rampage. One afternoon he decided to start destroying everything in his sight at the unit where he lived in. He was really going off on one, kicking through windows, throwing plant pots off the buildings at people going by. I don't know if he's trying to kill them or what. He was stealing people's shoes for some reason, smashing car windows. After about 15 minutes of mayhem, he must have run out of steam and gone back to his unit. That's where we found him, and he decided to bung a turn. He just would not stop screaming and bashing his head and face into any sharp object that he could find. Eventually we got a van with a pod and secured him. Then we went back into the house to try and figure out what the hell had happened. When we get back to the house, it's an absolute mess. Somehow he had fit 2 coal trolleys inside and was using them as furniture. The whole place smelled of rotten food and stuff. On his coffee table, if you could call it that, he had loads of weird scrawled out notes, as well as a wooden box. Inside the wooden box was about 100 small clip seal bags. Over half of the bags had a brown organic material in them, the others had clear crystal stuff in them. He organised the bags from smallest to largest. Now with all the people in the area we had all sorts of wonderful ways that people were getting high. We were used to seeing weird stuff that people would ingest, so we wouldn't recognise these bags, but we got a pretty good idea that it's some kind of narcotic. So of course, we examined these bags and the contents. There is enough there to test if we need to, and I get one of the bags and empty it to see it better. Now there's lots of weird little freckles on these, and there's some weird little hairs on it. It's not unusual for a plant to have, but I've never seen it before. So I'm looking at it and holding it up, talking to my partner, saying that it might be a byproduct of some production of something else. Maybe it's a drug like cats, we're not sure. This might explain why the guy went nuts. A dog unit officer who assisted with the arrest comes in. He sees the scene, looks at the coffee table, looks at the bags, and looks at me holding one. He tells me that guy got golden staph. He's been collecting scabs. The guy had been picking at golden staph infection on his leg, collecting them and organising them smallest to largest, ingesting them too. It's the most disturbing thing that I've probably found on all of my time serving. I'm working 3rd shift on Halloween night. I'm out by one of the smaller lakes just outside of the city limits. Kids love to go to these and drink. Now we're surrounded by some very nice houses. Going through the neighbourhood, Each of the roads ends at a small 2-lane road that surrounds the lake. I'm slowing to the stop sign and already starting to look to my right to make the turn when my headlights started racing across the rock wall that surrounds the lake. I suddenly caught something out of the corner of my eye. As I look up at some of the trees dotting the surrounding of the walk path, I see that there's a guy hanging. At first I thought it was a Halloween decoration. The neighbourhood is really into decorating for the holidays. I stopped and got out, and as soon as my flashlight hits him, I realise nope. No decoration. He's actually dead. As I was standing there ready to radio it in, I noticed a gaggle of kids coming down the street trick-or-treating, and as soon as they see my car, they started heading there way faster, so I book it back up the block to meet their parents. As I meet one of the parents, I tell her that she has to take the long way round. I tell her that something's wrong, and she looks up. She can see on my face that I'm not kidding. Not mine, but my sibling is a police officer and shared this story with me, and I can't get it out of my head. It'll stick with me forever. He was responding to a domestic disturbance in a pretty bad area near Detroit. Apparently it's reported that there was lots of screaming and banging on the second floor for a full hour before everything went quiet. Being a rough neighbourhood, they didn't bother to call until things started to smell. So my brother and his partner walked up to the door, waited, got no response except for a faint meowing. Finding the door unlocked, they went inside. Things were tossed around the living room everywhere. The TV was busted, as well as a few holes in the wall. It wasn't really a big deal though. They'd obviously been there from an argument. They still had to clear out the house though. And considering there were 2 voices reported in the kerfuffle, they'd seen 0 people so far. They then go try the bedroom, turn the handle, and instead of the door swinging open, my brother ends up walking into it with his shoulder and ramming against it because it's wedged shut. At this point, he knew he was about to walk into something bad and gave his partner that look and shoved the door. A multicoloured cat then ran out with his fur white, except for around its face that was a bit pink. Directly on the other side of the door was where the female of the argument ended up laying, back against it, half seated. She was barely recognisable. Next to her there was a bedpost, torn off and obviously used to bludgeon her. They looked around the room where the blood prints were everywhere, looking like they originated from under the bed and then around the room. Among the amounts of blood prints on the wall eventually led to the window, the girl having desperately tried to claw it open. A few chunks of her nails laid on the floor. Turns out they had nailed the window shut because it was a bad neighbourhood. The handprint circled the room, as well as a few face prints where her head was smashed against the wall, leading up to her final resting place. The guy who did it was never found. When I asked my dad to tell me some of the worst experiences that he had in the police force, I never expected to hear the gnarliest story that I've ever heard. He was often the first police officer on the scene after a death was reported. Many of these cases were old people who had heart attacks or strokes. But every now and then, he'd get called out to help deal with the locals who had fallen asleep in the bath or whatnot, and remained there submerged for days, sometimes weeks. He told us about the old man who had one of those heating elements that kept your bath warm. He slowly cooked there for 2 weeks before his daughter found him in what was essentially a human crock-pot without the lid. That was bad. The other story's worse. He was called out with his colleagues to help deal with an old man who had come from the pub, had a stroke and died. He had laid down in front of their electrical fireplace unit. Now here's where it gets even worse. His wife, who by this point was very far gone with Alzheimer's disease, had brought him a huge collection of toast, crumpets, beans on toast, etc., and numerous cups of teas, and laid them around her husband over the course of 2 weeks. My dad said that this lady had no comprehension of anything that he said to her. She either referred to the old guy as her boyfriend, the strange guest, or the gas man, though they'd been married for 40 years. When my old man and his colleagues proceeded to remove the corpse, they said it took him ages as the meat was so tender that it slipped off the bone or whatever part they were trying to lift and would remain on the ground. The smell was unfathomable, and no human should ever look the way that the old man did. I never knew half of the stuff my dad experienced in the police, but I guess I'm happy that I don't know the rest of it. Not me, but my friend is a major Canadian metropolitan, and one night that we're supposed to go out after his shift, he decided to pick me up in his cop car, since he was almost finished with his shift and was just about to drop off the car back at the depot. On the way through, he got a call that somebody was complaining about noises coming from their basement, and it sounded a lot like a person. He decided to make one last stop. I was told to wait in the car while he talked with the homeowner and checked it out. He was gone for about half an hour before he came back. He also had a look of pure terror on his face. Apparently, the homeowner was hearing loud thuds from his basement for a couple of weeks, but one day, on the day of the call, they were really loud and scaring him. So he had him walk into the basement, so he thought maybe somebody had broken in. My friend goes down to check it out. However, the basement is all dark and the lights need to be turned on from the electrical panel. So as they made their way to the panel and my friend says he saw something in the corner of his eye, he turns around and at the end of the hallway which leads to a cold storage area, he sees a guy's face around the door just standing there. He yells at the guy to turn and he doesn't. A homeowner sees him too and is really scared. My friend asks the guy to turn around once more before hitting the switches for the lights, and the guy/ghost at the exact same time disappear. My friend swore that he searched every inch of the basement and could not find anybody near. The homeowner is shook up and says that he's going to stay with a friend for the night and calls my friend to get another cop to survey the house while he's gone.